Thanks for coming, guys. Good to see you all again. First of all, does anyone have any more questions? We've just been answering a couple here from last class. Nope. Cool. Oh, no. Sweet. So just reflecting on last lesson, I kind of noticed that we went a bit overtime based on like questions and stuff like that, but I definitely want to prioritize the questions. So today I'm going to keep the presentation a bit shorter, and then we'll move into like the applying it section, and I'll kind of do that in parts and ask questions after each one, and we can mainly work on fielding like the questions that you guys have, and then obviously applying it as well. But I really liked last week how there was so much interaction, so I kind of want to make that more of the thing with the kind of workshop interactive feeling. But first, I just want to give a bit of background on samples, what makes up samples, what are their main properties, and like what do you need to look for when using samples. So this is going to be a presentation on choosing a sample. And when there's samples, there's four things that you need to think about. The first is the sample rate and the bit depth. The second is the key. The next is the tempo, and the next is the swing. So sample rate and bit depth. This is how we explain any sort of digital audio is always going to have sample rate and bit depth. So we have a sample here in this panel here. And if we were to like zoom in on this a bunch in Ableton, you get to this point where you can actually start to see these individual points. And that is actually all the information that it has for this audio sample. So it doesn't have a straight continuous line. It just has all of these little points, and then it just draws a straight line between those points. So if you imagine like a pure analog signal, then that would just be a pure curve. But as soon as it goes into a computer, computers can't record pure curves. They can only record points. So what it does is it records a bunch of points like this, and then it plays all those points, and it's a pretty close approximation to what the analog signal will be like when it comes out of the speakers. And this is what sample rate and bit depth tell us. So if we look down here, I've made up a kind of dodgy image, but imagine that this is a waveform and we have all of these individual points here. Well, the sample rate is how many of these points do we hear per second. So typically CD was 44.1 kilohertz, which means that there's 44,100 points every second that we hear. And now typically DAWs and things operate at 48, but you can, like last week where we looked at the audio settings, you can change the sample rate up to, I think, like 192,000 samples a second, but 48,000 is generally still considered high quality. Bit depth is how accurate can it record these different volume levels. So being able to see the difference between this one and this one, they're like slightly different heights. The resolution of that is the bit depth. So, and the way they calculate that is 2 to the power. So you usually see things like 16 bits or 24 bit. Some people might have had the experience where you download something off Bandcamp, put on a USB, and then the CDJs can't read it. That's usually because this bit depth is too high and the CDJ can't read it. But basically higher bit depth means like higher quality in the fine volume levels, and sample rate is how many samples we get per second. Sample rate, you go 44 to 48 and it's only like a 10% or 20% increase in quality because you've just gone an extra 8,000 samples a second. But the bit depth, because it's to the power, if you go from 16-bit to 24-bit, it's something like at least 100,000, if not like 1,000,000 times better resolution. So increasing the bit depth from 16 to 24 is a huge increase. Increasing sample rate from 44 to 48 is just a slight increase. And now this is pretty technical, and it's the most technical that we'll get in this whole workshop. But I basically just bring this up because not all samples are made equally. And if you download like MP3 samples online, they're going to be far, far lower quality than this. And that's going to reflect in the overall sound of your music if you're using poor quality samples. But the higher the sample rate and bit depth means that the files will actually be bigger. So if you max all of these settings out, then you'll find that your projects get like really, really big, really quick. So it's about and it will also mean that your processor and your RAM will be really challenged. So you kind of just want to find that point where your computer still runs well, but you're using the highest quality quality possible. And this is going to lead into why I suggest using something like Splice, or just using sample packs that have high quality. And then you never really have to think about this because you just know that the samples you're downloading are going to be high quality. All right, musical keys. So who here has an understanding of like basic music theory? Cool, a couple people. So when we're talking about musical keys, we have 12 possible notes to choose from, but generally in a scale, we have 7 of those notes. But which 7 notes we choose out of the possible 12 give you the mood of your song, and that's what's referred to as a key. And so we can see here that we've got the C major scale and the C minor scale, and some of the notes are the same, but 3 of them are flattened for the minor, and that's what gives major a happy feeling and minor a sad feeling, is the 3rd, 6th, and 7th notes are flattened. So when you see musical key, it refers to which 7 notes out of the possible 12 are we going to use in this song. Typically, dance music is written in minor keys, so you're generally going to be looking at A minor, B minor, C minor, etc. And they're all going to be using a combination 7 notes out of the possible 12 that we can have. Now, DJs in the room have probably seen this colorful wheel here. This is known as the Camelot wheel in DJing, but what this is in music theory is called the circle of fifths, which we see here. And how we use this in DJing is we know that if a track we're playing is in A minor, then we can mix with a track in D minor, E minor, or C very easily. It's going to sound like the songs pretty much just go together. And we can see that in these circle of fifths, because if we look at these the key signatures as we go across, the difference between A minor and E minor is only 1 note. So as we go from each key around this circle, we're just changing 1 note in that scale. So that's why you can mix from A minor to E minor really easily, because there's only 1 note difference. So the chance of that 1 note clashing is pretty low. And A minor and C major, now they have a different relationship. That's called a relative minor to a relative major. And if you have a keyboard, if you play all the white keys starting at the C note and you go up, that's going to be the C major scale. But if you play all the white notes but start at A minor and A instead and go A, B, C, up, that's the A minor scale. So that tells us that every major scale has a minor scale that actually has the exact same notes in it, but because we start in a different place, it actually has a totally different feeling. So how we're going to use this in our production is that if we're writing a track in, say, A minor, then we could potentially use samples in E minor or D minor, and they might still fit in our song, but mainly we're going to be looking for samples in the same key that we're writing in. So The other thing that we have to think about as producers, which you don't really have to think about in normal, in like using instruments and that sort of thing, is what frequency is the bass note in each key. So say I'm writing a song in F, then the bass note in F is at 43 Hertz. And you can look up a frequency response of a speaker. So you just write your speaker name and then frequency response at the end of it. And it will show you a curve like this. And we can see that this speaker here at about 50 Hertz rolls off. So it doesn't really produce anything below 50 Hertz. So that would make it very difficult for us to write a song in D, for example, because the subfrequency is 36 Hertz and we can't even hear that through this speaker. So writing in these super deep keys, C, C sharp, and sort of somewhat D, but definitely C sharp, C, and if you go lower than that to the low B and low A sharp, often you can't actually hear the sub through your speakers unless you have a sub, because it's literally just too low for your speaker to make it. So we probably want to be writing in keys that we will be able to hear the full spectrum of the song. So most speakers, you're looking at like E and up, are gonna sound a lot fuller through your speaker, literally just because you can hear the full range of the frequencies that you're making. Whereas if you go below E, it starts to sound really cool and dark and deep, but you're probably going to be stabbing in the dark a bit when it comes to production, because you're not actually going to be able to hear these frequencies unless you have a subwoofer. I think that like F is one that is a really nice middle ground, and it still sounds nice and deep, but you can hear it really clearly on most speakers. A lot of psytrance is written in G, and a lot of techno is written in like C sharp, because you kind of want that like deeper, darker sounding frequencies. But I just bring this up because it is good to be aware of whether or not you're actually going to be able to hear your sub through your speakers. Tempo and timing. So we've looked at the notes. We know that we want our samples to be in the correct key, and we've looked at choosing a key that's going to work well with our speakers that we're producing on. Now tempo. So tempo is usually seen as, or usually referred to in BPM, which is how many beats per minute occur. And typically in all dance music, or 99% of dance music, it's in 4/4 timing, which means that there's 4 beats in the time that there's 4 quarter notes. So I've got my kick here on every quarter note. We can see there's 4 of those evenly spaced in my bar. 3/4 would be if we were to fit 3 kicks in the timing that usually 4 would play. That is kind of like a waltz feeling. Very rare for that to actually be used in dance music. However, we do get like a false 3/4 timing in dance music quite a bit, and that's known as triplets. So we can see here that underneath my kick, I've fit 3 MIDI notes in evenly spaced between these kicks. So that might be seen as might feel like a different timing, but as you can see, we still have 4 kicks for every bar. So it's still 4/4, but since there's 3 beats for between every kick, that's called triplets. And here we can see that this would be 4 16th notes between the kicks, and that's known as 16ths, or sometimes referred to as like a straight groove. Swing. So swing refers to generally how late the 2nd and 4th 16th note is. And we can see here that this sample has swing, because these beats here are actually always a little bit late. So even though this is in 4/4, because we can see that the main notes are all hitting bang on the line, all of these in between hits are off the grid. And that's what we refer to as the swing of the sample. Cool, so let's get into it. Does anyone have any questions there actually?
Just about producing with certain keys.
Yeah.
If you're producing on headphones, is there something that you need to keep in mind, or just as in like the quality of your headphones is going to determine what you can hear, or you have a greater sense of hearing full spectrum? How does that translate to headphones?
Typically you may be able to technically hear a bit lower in headphones, but in general, it's hard to get a good feeling for sub levels in headphones. Like pretty much even now after years, and like all my lessons are done on headphones when I do them online and stuff. So I write in headphones all the time. Nearly every time I bounce a track out from writing on headphones and listen to it in my car or something, it's way too bassy, because you don't get that build up woofy feeling ever in your headphones. And it's kind of fun to be able to really hear the bass in your headphones. So typically you will find that it's too bassy in headphones, but that's not as much about hearing if there's any distortion or anything in the low end. You probably can hear that in headphones, but just in general, you probably have your kick and bass too loud if you're writing in headphones. And then even still, like if I get the bass levels sitting right in my studio and I've referenced it and it sounds good, when I listen on headphones, I'm a bit like, oh, I wish there's a bit more bass, So like maybe I'll train myself out of that, but I just know that it's just a thing that I have to do after writing on headphones, is just turn the bass down a bit. Yeah, I guess this would probably be either hats or bassline. Because if you were often, your hats kind of follow the bassline rhythm. So yeah, like if you were doing triplets in bass, and like a lot of people actually call this triplet bass because it goes boom digga digga boom digga boom digga boom, like that rolling psytrance bass, and you can hear the three notes, but you actually hear kick 2 3 4, kick 2 3 4. So that's still sixteenths. The triplet sounds like ba-da-da, 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 ba-da-da. That's 1 2 3 1 2 3. That's the triplet sort of sound. And typically you don't see that in techno very much at all. But in prog, it's a huge thing to have that bit where, it's in rolling sixteenths and then it goes to triplets. And even though the kick drum is still the same tempo, because the bass line has technically slowed down because you're only fitting 3 notes in, it feels like you've changed the tempo of the track and it gets slower. And I feel like that's probably why it's used in prog and psytrance a lot, because it's got this like sort of time warp effect. But as you can see, say I had a song in triplets and I was trying to mix it into a song that was in sixteenths, well, these are all going to clash because they're at slightly different timing. And that means that's what makes mixing tracks in triplets really annoying, because you can't really mix it into a track that's not in triplets. And that's usually why in psytrance songs you have like your straight section and then it goes into like a trippy triplet section, but then it will always go back at the end so that you can actually mix out. And I've made that mistake in quite a few songs where I've gone to triplets for the last drop and then the song's finished in triplets, but it's always like a nightmare to try and mix out of it. So now I'm trying to add that extra little section on the end where it goes back again so that you can mix out of it, just for making it easier to perform the songs. Does anyone have any other questions? Wicked. Cool, so I'm setting up my project here. I'm gonna write in 128 today. And I'll save this as samples workshop, and I like to do the BPM and the key there. So this is D sharp minor, and it's just nice to have that in your project title so that you can just look up here if you ever forget what key you're writing in. In Ableton 12, We can also set the key for the entire project. So I'll go ahead and do that here now as well. And go to D sharp minor. As you can probably see from what I talked about before, D sharp is like right on 38 hertz, and like most speakers roll off at around 40 hertz. So D sharp's a really nice one for like being as like low sounding as you can while still really hearing the sub. D is also okay for that, but then below that, and you actually stop being able to hear the sub on small speakers. But of course, you can hear them in clubs and stuff like that. Like, you know, a lot of people, a lot of dark prog is lower than that, but it's just a lot harder to write because you can't really hear what's going on. Cool. So this is Splice. And this is one way of getting samples to use. The other way is downloading whole packs. But generally, like, you know, obviously if you can acquire samples for free, then getting packs could be good and you just go through your own personal time of sorting them out. But using Splice, you pay like $10 or $15 a month and you get 100 credits a month, which means 100 samples. And then you can just choose which ones you think you're actually going to use, and then it saves them in this library. So I've just downloaded a couple kicks. I think that one sounds pretty good. So, and then you can just drag that straight in like so. I've already got it there. And now the next thing I want to grab is some sort of perk. So I'll just drop that in there. And first thing I want to see is if there is any sort of swing. So if I turn 16th notes on the grid, I can see that that's bang on, which is very nice. And when I drop the kick in, the kick is probably going to be full volume when I drop it in, but I actually don't want it to be full volume, because if I have my kick at 0, then when I build a track on top of it, it's going to get too loud and we're going to see all sorts of red in this section on the meters, which we don't want. So when I drop my kick in, I'm just going to press tab to get over to my mixing view. And I can see this top number. This top number tells me what the volume is. So -6.6. So I'll just boost that up a little bit. And we can see that's like -5.97. I want that to be basically -6. So that's a nice start. So the first thing I'm going to do with this little perk sample is we've got a nice little hit there. And I wanted, so I'm lucky, and another good thing about using Splice is generally it has the note or the key on it. But if you had a sample that you don't know what the note or key is, you can drop an EQ8 on there. And we'll just click this little arrow here to open it up bigger. And we can see that there's one very strong frequency coming through there. So if I just hover over this with my mouse, we can see that down here, it tells me what note that is. So that's actually an F. So that isn't a D sharp, but what we want to know is, okay, it's not a D sharp, but is it still in the key? So I'll just pull up a MIDI clip here, right click, and go insert empty MIDI track. And over here, you just want to set the scale that you're using, so D sharp minor. And I'll zoom in here and I can see, yep, sure enough, D sharp is in the scale. But all of these pink ones are also going to be in the scale. So I can look here and I can see that, well, strangely, it's called E#2 here, but there is actually no E#, so that's an F. So the F is just the second note in our scale, so we can totally still use that in this track. If it's any of these pink notes, at least it's going to be still within the scale. Why that doesn't just say F is a music theory thing that is beyond my scope as a musician, but they just like to call it something differently when it is in different scales. But there's no B# or F#. So if you ever see a B# or an F#, like B# is just the C and E# is an F. Cool. So like that perk's kind of cool. I don't think I want to use that whole kind of rhythm though. And I want to sort of make something my own from this perk. So I'm going to right click here and insert an audio track. And now I want to record from number 2. So if I want to record from number 2, I just click here and go to number 2 and hit arm. And then if I hit record, we can see we're recording in there. So I'm going to go up here and grab a reverb. And I'm going to boost the wet dry up a bunch there, boost the decay up a bunch. So we get something like that. And now I'm going to hit record. And then I'm going to shorten this up, press Control D to duplicate, and then I'm going to press R on there to reverse it. You can also double click and right click here and go there used to be reverse sample in here. I'm pretty sure on Ableton 12, yeah, you just click here, reverse. Now I want to line this up with the end of the bar, and you can see as it's snapping it can be a bit tricky to do that, so you can hold down the Alt key and that will just turn off the locking. And now we've got something, and I'll just turn that reverb off here. Now we've got something like this. And you know, maybe we want to make something else from this as well. So going to make a new audio track, and just like we did before, route it from the second one here. I'll turn the arming off of this one and turn it on there. And next I'm going to just put an echo on there. I'll turn the feedback up a bit. One really cool thing with echoes is that if you change the time in the middle of it playing, it actually changes the pitch as well. So it sounds like this. Like so. And by default, that's going to be locking to the grid. Let me just... turn the mic down a little bit so I can turn this up. Nice. But say I wanted to keep it on like more of a free timing, well then what we want to do is we want to turn the sync off of the echo here, and then we can see that we have it in milliseconds. So that means that I can get a more smooth sound like this. But it would be nice if we could start it on like a rhythmic pattern and then move it off of that. So how would I figure out how many milliseconds like a quarter note is? And Ableton makes that really easy, because if I just select this part of the timeline, which would be 1.5 quarter notes, and I hover my mouse over here, down the bottom here, it actually says how long it is in milliseconds. So we can see that's 703 milliseconds. Maybe I'd want just like this much timing, which would be 352 milliseconds down the bottom. So I'm gonna go ahead and just type that in there, and right click and go show automation. And I'll just put that there and then have it automating like so. And then we get this effect. So all together. So we've got a couple cool effects just from that one hit there. Now let's look for some hats. So I'll pull up my splice here and search hats. Now a hat is pretty much an atonal sound, like it's a sort of a metallic hit. And generally we wouldn't think of that as having a note. So it's not super important to be in the same key, but I have found that if it is in the right key, it does still make it sound a bit better. So we can see we've got all of these different options here. But most of them are not in the BPM that we want. So I'm going to select one that is and one that isn't, and we can have a look at the differences there. All right, these are all sorts of different trap and stuff. So I'll select techno here. Cool. Oh. Alright, that's a whole loop. Just want some shakers. Cool. That doesn't tell me what BPM it is, so that'll be a good example. So I just press like that to download it, and we can drop that straight in here. Let's get one that's in 128. Maybe not techno. Like, no, although when they are, it does seem to keep it tighter, but it's generally more of a case of doing it by ear rather than actually finding one that is in the, like, says that it's in the right key. And usually I would just do that by dragging in a sample like so. And simply, now it's going to be difficult because we don't have a whole lot of melodic elements at this point. But you would basically double click on the sample like this, turn off warp, or put warp onto complex, and where you have this pitch adjustment, just see what it sounds like 1 or 2 up and 1 or 2 below, and just see if it seems to fit better in your song. If it doesn't, just leave it on 0. So as we can see, this one is bang on the 128 that we want. We can see all of those 8th notes are in the right place, but it does have some swing to it. So that's going to be interesting if we want to get the other things to match it. We can see this one above is also pretty bang on 128. And now I'm going to look for one that's, say, 120. Nice. All right, so we've got a sample that's not synced with our track. It hasn't been designed in the same BPM, and we can see here that the sample is progressively more and more out of time. So what we'd immediately go to do is press this warp button. So what warp does is that's how we're going to sync these into our timing of our track. So we could press warp like so. And if I just change this BPM to what the BPM of the loop is, we can see suddenly now it's locked in. However, since we had to change the BPM of this sample, we're going to be warping it in a way that changes what it sounds like. So let's have a look at these different warping settings and see how they sound differently. So we'll go to beats, tones, slightly more grainy texture. So that really sounds quite a lot more digital than the original sample. Repitch, which probably sounds the cleanest, but you can hear now it's changed the pitch a little bit. It's a little bit higher. And then there's complex and complex pro. And most of them are quite similar when it's doing a small thing like this. But on hats, the risk of changing the BPM of the sample is that it starts to sound more and more unnatural. So in the case that I have a sample like this, where it's not in the same BPM as my track, what I would probably prefer to do is actually, with Control E, cut out the sample and make my own loop. So I'm going to hold down Alt to make this one a bit shorter. Just move that over and line it up. Line this one up here. And then I'll just duplicate that out. So that way I'm basically keeping the exact same sample quality as I had, but I'm putting it into the timing of my track through actually positioning them rather than using the warping method. And you'll find that different types of sound take to warping better than others. Drums are sort of in the middle, like they're okay, but not amazing. But something like a pad is probably going to take to warping really well because it doesn't have the same like metallic sounds that a sample has. Now, this hat sample that we've got, it's bang on the right BPM, but we can see there's some swing in here. And if we have another channel, another sample that has different swing, well, then those two samples are going to clash a bit. Or if we want to start putting some MIDI on top of this, when we put those MIDI notes in, they won't have the same swing. But Ableton has a really cool way of dealing with this, and what you do is you just grab your sample, right click, and you go to extract groove right here. And now we've actually got that groove as a groove in our groove template. So if we made any MIDI, we could just apply this groove in this groove section, and it will lock our other samples and MIDI to the groove of that one. So if you find like a really nice percussion loop or something and you're like, oh, I just love the groove of that, I want to make the groove of my track based around that, you'll drop that sample in, right click and go, where is it? Extract groove. And then you can apply that same swing to other samples and other MIDI. So to do that, for example, I might use, I'll grab another sample. And I think this time I'll look for some shakers. At 128. Like so. Whoop. And you can see that if we zoom in here, this shaker sample has a straight groove and this has more of a swingy groove. And if we listen to those together, if I hold down Control, I can select them both at once. And you can hear there's a bit of clashing happening there because on these notes, they're not playing at the same time. So what I could do is I could select this entire sample, right click, and go quantize settings, and we want to quantize that to 16ths. Apply. And then over here in the groove, I can select my groove, and if I press the commit button right here, we should be able to see these guys move over a little bit. There we go. You see those ones are now shifted over and they're much closer to being in line with that other sample. So still a bit of funny business going on here, but as you can hear, as you can see, they've now been synced up. So you don't want to have too many samples with different swings because it starts to get quite messy sounding. So it's best to either choose a swing from the groove pool like we looked at last lesson. Just as a reminder, you can access the groove pool by pressing grooves in your browser, and then you have all of these different groove settings you can choose from. Typically, I only work with these swing 16ths and then the swing logic 16ths. Anything that says 16ths here is good to go. All of the other ones are probably going to be a bit messy sounding for dance music, but by all means, prove me wrong. Cool. So now these warp settings here, at the moment it's on repitch, but they are named after what they're meant to be used for. So we'll usually find that with drum samples, when you're warping them, beats is what you want to be on. And we can hear, I'll just boost this volume a bit. That's on beats. Compared to texture, you can hear it's starting to spread out a bit. It's not as tight. Tones definitely is not working. Beats sounding a bit better. If you want to get the beats even tighter, you can go down here and there's 3 different symbols here. And this is a good segue into why does warping actually change what the sample sounds like. And that goes down to what we were talking about at the beginning of the lesson, where if I zoom in all the way here, we can see that eventually the samples are all just made up of individual points, and that's all the information that it has. However, what happens if I stretch this sample? Like, now it needs to, we're getting those 2 points, we're moving them further away, and there's just empty space in between them. And Ableton needs to know, how am I going to fill up this new empty space that we have from stretching it? And how it fills up that empty space is determined by these different settings. And on Beats mode, it has a few different options here. And what it actually does is it makes a tiny little loop, and it just will loop that section in between the sample. So in between here and the next one, it's going to just repeat this over and over again until it gets to the next one. This on the top, on this setting here, it does a little back and forth loop. On this setting here, it just loops forward. And on this setting here, it just gates, which means that it just plays from the last warp marker, which are what these yellow things are called. It just plays that until it gets to the next one. So we can see that if I have it on this one, which is like the arrow into the straight line, as I turn down this setting here, it starts to basically tighten it up. So all we're hearing is the actual transients, and we're not hearing anything in between them. And that kind of gives you some sort of insight into how these different algorithms are set up, because Beats is always going to prioritize the transients, like the impact, the attack of the different sounds. Whereas something like Tones tries to extend the texture, because if we were using a pad or a vocal or something like that and we wanted to stretch it, we don't want to maintain the sharp bits, we want to maintain the smooth bit. And that's where Tones really helps with that. But as you can hear, it doesn't sound so good on drums, because what we want is the sharp bits. So with that in mind, what can we do if we stretch things out really, really far? And what does that sound like? So let's get our splice back up. And as we kind of saw there, when there's sharp little transients like hats or something like that, and we start to stretch it, it starts to sound funny pretty quickly. So maybe I'll search something that has a lot of transients, something like some key. Oh, that's actually not what it's going to show me. Foley metal or something like that. I wanted to find like this sound, but I know if I search keys, it's going to be piano. That's pretty cool. Who here's heard of this term Foley before? Nope. So Foley is what they call a recording of a sound that's used in film, TV, gaming, which is like real sounds from the world. So, you know, when you watch a movie and someone's walking across and you can hear their footsteps, they haven't actually recorded their footsteps during that scene. They've recorded the sound of a footstep, and then they layer that back in to give you that natural feeling. So if you want to find recordings of real things, it could be birds, it could be impacts, it could be scraping sounds, whatever. If you put the word Foley before it, that's how you're going to get these sorts of like textural sounds that are non-musical. Grab that one too. One thing that I really like to use Foley-wise is vegetables. So we can usually find some, maybe like pumpkin. Nope. Pretty sure that this is a pack on Splice. Nope. That's a good sample pack, by the way, if anyone wants it. It's like a whole sample pack of just vegetables being smashed. Yes. Yes.
That was on Splice?
Well, all of this stuff is on Splice.
The vegetable bites pack?
I didn't get it off Splice, but I swear at some point while I was searching Splice, I found it and I was like, oh, I could have got it here. But just then when I searched it, it didn't come up. But you might have to search it on the website or something like that. Because I'm guessing the samples don't have that in their name, but the overall pack does. But there's some great juicy slurpy sounds in there. Oh, Jesus. All right, so we've got something like this, like a highly textural sound. And now I'm going to double click on here. And first I'll engage warping and I'm going to put this on texture. And then I'm just going to press ×2 a few times and that's going to stretch it out a bunch. As we can see, it's stretched out quite a bit. And now if we listen to it like that, we got some pretty interesting textures from there. I think now it could be a good time to just make this loop a little bit longer. And we can see that like the ×2 is not working anymore, but we've still got quite a bit of BPM range. So I'm just going to manually push that up here all the way to 999. So now we can hear that there's some pretty interesting like textures there, and you would never necessarily guess that it came from, you know, some crunchy noise. And then maybe what you'd want to do is manually sort of warp it into the timing that you want. So if I want to add a warp marker anywhere in here, I can just double click and then I can start moving these sorts of sections around a bit. Now in texture, we have a few different parameters here that's going to change the sound of it. So grain size is, as it tries to fill in the space between these little samples, it's going to make these little loops. And once loops get so small that they become textural, they're known as grains. So the size of the grain, you can think about that as like how big are these tiny little loops that it's making. And if we put this really, really low, we can see that it gets super smooth because the grains are so small that it's kind of just turning into one smooth texture. But as I push this up a lot, we can actually hear those like individual loops happening. And as you can hear, moving that actually sounds quite nice as well. And one thing you'd probably want to do is automate that. But when I right click on there, there's no automate option. Thankfully, we can actually still automate that, but it's not on the timeline here. It's in this envelopes section. So if I click here and go down here, we can see now grain size has popped up there. But again, it's a little bit confusing because here we have like a number from 263 to 2 to 263. But up here, we just have 100%. Well, what does that mean? Like the 100% here is whatever value we have here. and then I can just automate that down. So then we might get this effect. Now, flux is a little bit funny and slightly hard to explain, so I'm going to press this I, and I'm just going to hover over it and see what Ableton says. Flux introduces randomness into the processing of the sample. Larger values means more randomness, which means that instead of perfect little loops, so say there's a sample here and if the flux is super low, it's going to grab that exact sample and loop it over and over again. But if the flux is high, it's going to grab little bits of samples around that point and scatter them around. So if we want a more smooth and continuous sound, we want the flux to be up. But if we want it to sound maybe more unnatural or glitchy, we probably want the flux lower. That's low flux. That's high flux. So you can't really hear a huge difference on this sample. But these warp settings will, like, all of this warp stuff that we're doing is going to sound very different depending on what the sample is. And this is like one of my favorite parts of Ableton and production, and probably one of the things that keeps me on Ableton the most, because Ableton has like really interesting warp settings, is that every time I go to do this sort of exploration where I get a sample and stretch it out really big, I never quite know what I'm going to discover in there. Because like, you're basically like, you know, it's like when you see those videos where they get like a microscope and they zoom up super close on something, and you're like, wow, that's what it actually looks like. Like the super zoomed in world of audio often has a lot of like interesting and unpredictable areas, like the more you zoom in. And it gives you this fun feeling that you're kind of discovering the sound. Like you're not necessarily designing it as much as you're discovering it. And for me, that's something that I find really exciting about sound design, because, you know, it's all good to like have an idea and create it, but then to actually feel like you found something and it's just like this little gem that you're going to use is really exciting. And it kind of takes you out of your head a little bit as well. So the next thing I want to do here is maybe I want to change the pitch of the sample while it's playing. So down in the same clip section, I can go to transposition. So I could draw in some pitch curves here. So now that we've got this cool sound effect, I'm going to do a little bit of processing on there. So the first thing I want to do is, we've got our kick, and that's providing the low end for this track. And at some point we might have a bass that would also provide the low end. But a sound like this is a top layer, and pretty much anything that's not your kick and bass is a top layer. And therefore we don't want it interfering with our kick and bass at all. So we're going to want to put a low pass EQ on there, a low cut EQ on there to cut out those low frequencies. And as you can see in this sample, there's actually quite a lot of those low frequencies in there. So I'm going to put an EQ 8, and on the band number 1, put it to this ×4 low cut and engage that at 150 Hertz. And we can see we can just take that low end out of there. Now, a handy tip is that you can actually right click here and go save as default preset. So as you probably saw, when I dropped in the EQ8, it was automatically on this shape, because I know that 99% of the time I drop an EQ onto something, it's going to be I'm going to cut the lows out, and also I'm going to cut out the super high frequencies. So 18 kilohertz is pretty open. This could even be down to like 16 kilohertz. And it's a similar idea that because we want our kick and bass to really sound low and fat, The way we do that is through contrast, and we just don't let any of our other channels have those low frequencies. So then in comparison to everything else, our kick and bass sounds really nice and deep. Same concept applies for our high frequencies. If we want the absolute shiniest parts of our track to sound really nice and shiny, to do that, we just want to be cutting out the high frequencies on everything else, so that then when there is a sound that has those super high frequencies, it just sings over the top because it's not competing with anything else. So making up an EQ8 like this with the lows and the highs cut, right clicking here and going save as default preset will just mean that whenever you drag in an EQ8, it's already set up like that. And then you can change it from there. But these are the two that you'll pretty much add every single time. So you may as well have those automatically there. And on default tracks, we can see that if I right click here and go insert MIDI track, I already have one of those on there. And that's because every time that I put a synthesizer into the channel, into the track, again, I'm going to want to cut the lows out unless I'm making the bass, which is only going to be one time in the whole project. So I may as well have this EQ on there as default absolutely every time I add a MIDI track. So, and I've also added a utility here. And as we saw last week, utility gives us all of the same things that we have up here and a couple extra things, but it means it's on our channel strip and we can automate all of these settings. So I find that having utility and an EQ8 on all my MIDI tracks is going to be a default, and I pretty much always drag them on there anyway. So again, on a MIDI track, you put these things on there, you right click, and right click is not behaving today. Then you can go save as default MIDI track. You could also do the same for audio if you like as well. I think I have it for audio, although I've turned it off before. Yeah, I don't have it for audio right now. And that's just because like when you're dragging in songs and stuff, it can be annoying if it's automatically cutting the lows. This is a couple little working things. So I've cut the lows out. I want to put some reverb on there. And now if I want to keep this sample as it is in its like super warped state, I can press Control J and consolidate that. And now we can see it's just like a normal sample, and it's basically converted all of those changes I made and just locked it in. And then I will just duplicate this last section here. Put it to the end, press R to reverse it. I'm gonna just change this kick rhythm a bit, just so we can hear a bit of the delicateness of these sounds a bit better. Cool, so we've looked at doing some fine warping stuff to make a sample just fit into our track. And then also what happens when you take those warping kind of to the next level. Now let's see if we can find a baseline. So yeah, in future sessions, we'll look at synthesizing a lot of bass lines and stuff like that. But I find that you can do so much with audio, with samples, and you can totally make a track your own using samples through these different methods of stretching and applying effects and that sort of thing. That'll do. So I'll put in this bass line. Now this one we can see is in D sharp minor and is in 128. If I solo my kick and bass together, we have this. But there's one problem there. Both of these are taking up roughly the same frequency. They're both in the low end, and we can see that the kick is hitting right on top of the bass, and that's going to be interfering with this section. So how we deal with this, how we get the kick and bass to groove together, is something that's called sidechain compression. So I'm going to put a compressor on this bass line and click this little arrow here, and this is where we select the sidechain. So we'll start off by just looking at compression in general. And we can see that at the moment, whenever my kick hits, when it goes above this line here, it actually turns it down a little bit. And that's what a compressor is. It's just something that whenever the signal goes above the threshold, it's just going to turn it down. And it's a way of controlling the volumes in our track. So typically, if we just have this on a track, we can see that at the beginning of each kick, every time the bass line plays, it's turning it down. This yellow line shows how much it's being turned down. But what we actually want here is we want the bass to get turned down every time the kick plays. So instead of being triggered off the channel that it's on, I want to sidechain it. So I'm going to press sidechain here. Audio from kick, and now we can see in here, what we can actually see is we can see the kick sample is coming through to our compressor, even though it's on the bass. And now we can see that the bass is getting turned down every time that kick plays. Just to make that a bit more extreme. So I'm going to pull this threshold way down. And you can hear that it's like ducking every time that kick plays. However, we've pretty much lost the bass now. Like, we can't really hear the bass. And that's because the entire kick is triggering it, when actually we want it to get triggered here, right at the beginning of the kick, and then we want it to fade back in. So to do that, we just engage this EQ and push that up to about 500 or 600. And we can see now it's a lot sharper, and we can adjust this release to decide how much we want. So I would say at this point here, you could very well press this little, ironically it's a floppy disk, who even knows what that is anymore, but you can click that to save it, and you could call this sidechain compressor or something like this. Yeah, you should be able to rename that. I don't know what's going on right now. But yeah, you could change that to sidechain compressor, and then you can just drop that in, and you can see that all of this sort of stuff that I said at the beginning is already set up. So the only difference is you probably want to push this ratio up to, say, like pretty high, maybe not infinity, but like 30 or 40 at least. And now we can hear. And we can hear how like the kick plays and then the bass line comes in after the kick, but they're not playing right on top of each other. And you can just adjust this here, how much you want it to occur. So pretty much once you dial this in kind of for one kick and bass, you could save this as a preset, and then all you really need to change is the threshold amount and the release, and that's really the only difference in every time you sidechain. Yep.
What's the threshold changing?
The threshold is changing at what level will the compression get engaged. So if we look over at this window, it's quite a bit clearer, and in this window I can adjust the threshold with this line. We can see that as the threshold goes below the tip of the kick, we start getting a little bit of compression, and as I put it all the way down, it's a lot. So the combination of the threshold and the ratio is how much it's actually applying the compression. The exact details into that gets a little bit tricky, but basically when you're sidechaining, you want a really high ratio, and then you'll dial in the threshold here. And in most other compression cases, you'll be having that ratio quite a bit lower. But the ratio is actually the steepness of not the return, because that's the release, but the steepness of this line here is the first line down is determined by the combination of the ratio and the attack. But I could easily do like a whole workshop on just compressors, so I don't want to like overdo it. It's one of those things that they're such a like mystical machine that, you know, years and years and years into producing, and you're still like figuring out exactly what all the settings do. But something like sidechaining is a very, very simple use of a compressor, and you can kind of just have these settings and forget it. So maybe somewhere else that I would like to do sidechaining is here's another example of two channels that are occupying the same frequency spectrum, and they're kind of clashing a little bit. So this here's my main hat, and here's like my sort of skippy in between hats. I always want my main hat to be like punching through above this one. So maybe I could open up that compressor thing I put on, and instead of having it going from the kick, this time I'll have it going from channel 5. Whoa. And that's going to just make this a bit cleaner, because it means that this one's going to be dominant, and then the one that has the sidechain compressor is going to kind of always sit behind whatever's dominant. But doing it on hats is certainly like a more subtle and advanced technique, whereas doing it on the kick and bass, that's sort of like 101 kick and bass mixing is going to be using that sidechain to make the kick duck out of the bass. All right, we can see we've got some issues because just before that was redlining, and I think this one's way too loud. So the next thing we'd grab is going to be a snare or a clap or something along that line. Cool. And now I just want to have a quick chat about snares. So an actual snare drum, which is sort of what we're imitating, has it like it's a physical drum, and then on the bottom of it, it has these little tiny metal beads. And when you hit the snare drum, you hear like a doo from the drum, and then you hear like a from these little metal beads rattling. So we can kind of think of our snare drums as being made up of like a tom hit, and then also some sort of fizzy texture on top of it as well. And the fizzy texture, that's not going to have any key. That's just going to be like noise. But the actual tom drum will have some sort of note, because every drum has like a note to it. So we do kind of want to be a bit conscious of that. So when I'm searching for a snare drum, I am going to search it in the key that I want. Nice. But the BPM doesn't matter as much, because we're actually going to place these snares where we want them. So we don't necessarily actually need them to, it doesn't need to be the right BPM, because we're just going to place them where they need to go. But the key is more important. And just like I did before, I can have a look at that by going to my audio effects here, going EQ8, opening that up, and having a look at this, we can see that there's a very clear frequency there. And if I hover over that, we can see that it's bang on D sharp. Now, if we found a snare that was in D, this is where having two screens is very helpful when doing this sort of sample stuff. Just a side note, this KSHMR are all super good samples for like prog and techno making, and they actually have a full sample pack, and that might be one that I would actually recommend. But they are also all on Splice, so you could just search KSHMR in the search bar and it'll show you all of those. But I just find that even when I'm not looking for them, I end up finding samples. I'm like, oh, that's nice. And it's always this KSHMR on the front of it. So yeah, those are real good. But if we have this sample that is in D, and we drop the snare in, we put the EQ8 on there, and we have a look at where that peak is, and as we can see, that's like on D. Well, then I'll just double click here, press warp, put it on beats, and then just put that pitch up 1. And now it's in the key of my track. If there was a snare and you don't know what key it is, you could do that same thing. Drop the EQ on and just see where that bottom spike is, and then you just put it on beats mode because it's a drum, and then adjust the pitch so that it's either the main note of your track, or, as I showed you before in the MIDI note, the MIDI scale, just one of the notes in the scale, but typically having your snare on the note that your track, like the root note of your track, is going to be better. Now, what if we were like 6 out or something and I boost that 6? Well, now we're significantly changing like what the tone of the snare is, and you might not like it anymore once you pitch it into your track. So that could be a good reason why you would look for a different sample. Does anyone have any questions there? Absolutely. So with EQ8, you can click this little arrow here and it just brings it up a bit bigger. And with a snare drum, there's always going to be the frequency that is the tom part of it. And that generally sticks out like a spike. So we can see here, the tom spike is right there. And if I hover my mouse over where that is, over here, it says what note it is. So I can see that when I line it right up, it says D down there. If you look at a sample, like let's have a look at our hat here. If we look at the hat, you see there's no clear spike. And we can also hear that in a hat, you don't really have a note. So if you put in a sample, put the EQ on there and open up like this, and there's no clear spikes, it may be safe to assume that there is no note and you can just ignore the tuning of it. You could zoom in on all of these individual spikes, but they're not going to tell you anything very valuable. But when we compare that to the snare, we can see that there's really super clearly frequency that's poking out. Now, funnily enough, once we get that frequency in tune with our track, we're gonna just go ahead and cut all of that out because our snare is layering on top of our kick. We want our kick to give that punch. We don't need the snare giving that punch as well. So I'm gonna cut that out. However, still the overall tone of the snare is determined by that. So when you drop it in, you want to have it low so you can see what frequency that is, and then just chop it away. And you can see, well, that makes a big difference, like by cutting that out. But if we solo it with the kick, you see, like, when you have that low end and the kick playing, it just adds this kind of like muddiness. And often it pretty much does the same thing. Like it serves the same purpose with or without that low end. And the general rule with EQing is that if it doesn't need the frequencies, it shouldn't have them. Because whenever you have a track soloed like this, it's always going to sound nicer when you give it its full range. But ultimately, once you add all your layers together, any frequencies that don't need to be there are going to just add to muddiness. So we want to get in the habit of removing any frequencies that don't need to be there, and the end result of our song will be a lot cleaner because of it. So now, as I described before, the snare drum is made up of the body and then also the fizzy bit on the top. And here we can hear that that's sort of all of that stuff. But perhaps we want to add some like more interesting texture than that. Like, after all, we have like infinite options in this method of producing. So let's find one of these little bits of Foley from before. I'll just chop out that bit. Add a new audio track there and drop this in. And now this is sort of how we're going to look at layering different samples together. So if we put an EQ on there, I want to look at what frequencies this sound has. So we can see it has pretty much all of them. But if I do a little spike like this, I can kind of find that like the real like textural juicy part of this sound is about at 1K. So I'll just cut away there. I'll add a little bell here and push most of this stuff down. And then in my snare, I kind of want to do the opposite of that. So at 1K, I'm going to do a little dip like so. And now, as we layer them together, we've got a more interesting sort of textural snare sound than if we just had the snare on its own or that on its own. And we can see that since we've carved out, we've boosted the section that we like from our texture layer, and we've cut out of our snare what we want to put in the texture, and then we can join them together and we get like a much more interesting snare sound. But it still sounds quite natural, because with snares we do expect there to be that sort of texture on the top. And this is where like often I will layer claps or like hand clicks or like just straight Foley on top of my snares, and it still has like the good body of a snare, but the actual texture that you hear on top of it is unique and interesting. And the same can be done for our hats as well. So it's good to have the body of our hats to be made up of actual hat sounds, but we could also layer some other sorts of sounds on top of them to make it a little bit more interesting sounding. So one example of that might be, it's always so weird searching for these things. I think this might give me what I'm looking for. Oh, that's nice, but not what I'm looking for. All right, cool. That's got two interesting bits to it. So let's grab that. And let's separate this out. So I'm going to press Alt so I can click off the grid, and then Control E to cut. I'm going to just cut that up. And I think this sort of, that bit there, I'm going to just chop off that little sharp bit on the end. And maybe that can sweep into my snare so that then we get this sort of effect. And I'll just move this one over a little bit so that it's a little bit nicer warped. And then this little thing, I'm gonna just layer that on top of my hats. But since it's in the same channel as this other thing, I think it could be worth separating these. If you ever have sounds that are sort of doing different purposes, it's probably going to be good practice to separate them into separate channels so that you can process them separately. And that's how, you know, when you saw that project last week that had like 100 channels, you can very quickly get lots of channels, because you might have 3, 4, 5 channels that are basically the same sound, but they're doing different things. And as much as that might seem kind of confusing, at the end of the day, it's easier to separate them and process them separately than it is to try and get a one-size-fits-all option. So for this one, it's going to be like my hat layer. I'm going to hold down Alt so I can move it, and like that. You see, I'm not super concerned about it being like all exactly on the line, because spreading them out a little bit's okay, but I want to get it pretty close. So if we listen to this, probably what I want on there is a bit, I want an EQ as always, and some reverb. And we can layer that on our hats. and now it's just a bit more of an interesting texture and sound. And if we layer this one in as well, so we've got some cool, interesting percussion there, but most of it's not actually made by percussion samples, but they're just little bits of Foley or other sorts of things that act as hits, but they're not necessarily drum hits. And I think that that's kind of a big part of achieving like an organic sound to your music, is using a lot of these sorts of Foley samples as drums or as different things. And it just gives it that really sort of interesting texture sound to it because you're using these different samples. So the last sort of thing that I want to look at is what we can do with vocals. So see if we can get some singing first. Pardon?
All these are royalty free from Splice?
Yeah, it's all royalty free because you are paying for them, I guess. Like you get 100 credits a month. That's not a vocal. So we can hear like there are all sorts of different things and they're all kind of affected and stuff like that. So there should be some options in here. Where you can go like raw, dry.
I wanna rush with you in the
Perfect vibe. All right, this could be good. Cool, so as you can hear, as I dropped it in, it's changed pitch, and that's because the warp mode is set to repitch. And that's not going to work for us in this setting because we want it to be in the same key. So we want to try these different warp settings now. So you can see beats mode, if I put it on that gate setting that we did before on the drums, on the vocal, it gives us this kind of interesting rhythm sound, which is not at all what sounds natural for vocals. So as we saw that beats on drums actually sounded the most natural, when we do beats on vocals, it sounds the least natural. But maybe something like tones can give us a really smooth result. And as you can see that this vocal was originally at 160 BPM, but using tones as the warp mode, we can actually get quite a natural sounding vocal from here. Now, if for example, we wanted to add that gate, we could select all of this, right click, quantize settings, and go onto 16s and do apply. Oh, it hasn't done it by default. That's annoying. Okay, well, we can add our warp markers manually if we go to 16ths and we just go boom, boom, boom. And if we add these points in by ourselves, then when we use this beats mode on this gate setting, we can it does a gate every time there's one of these yellow markers, and you can get that kind of gate effect, which could be useful for what you're going for. Another super quick way to get gated vocals is to use the auto pan. So auto pan basically automatically pans it left and right. So you can hear that going around like that. You can change the rate. So that can be a cool effect to get some spatial effect. But actually, if you go over here to phase and put that down to 0, now you can see that the stereo part's disappeared. And if we were to put this shape over to square, we can see we've got that same sort of gating effect. And if I want to sync that, I can go down here to this little music note. And there's those 16th gates. So maybe I'll do show automation and have this start gated and go down. And you could mess around with the shapes here. However you like. This is random. You could also do like what we did before and stretch this out even longer so that now it's quite a long way from where it was naturally. And we can see it can start getting pretty weird, but in texture mode, if we tune this grain size and flux just right, you can still get it sounding natural-ish. And then maybe we'd put a big reverb on there. An EQ like we always do. And I'm just going to put this dry wet up super high so all we're hearing is the verb. And then if we put our compressor on there, and just like we did before, sidechain this to the kick. Ratio up, threshold down. Shortcut to looper section is Control L. And if we listen to this, so we can see if we have that off, it starts to drown out our kick, but with the sidechain on, we get that like fun breathing effect. But it feels a little bit low to me, so if I want it to be the same note but higher, I'll do it in increments of 12. So I'll just add 12 on here. And we can get quite a nice pad sound out of that.
Is that ST underneath the pitch semitones?
Yes, it is. Sometimes referred to as steps as well, but yeah, it's semitones. So because there's 12 notes, if you want to reach the same note again, you've got to go 12 up. Cool. So we've looked at stretching like a singing vocal and turning it into a pad. Now, if I want to get some talking, imagine you've got like a speech sample from somewhere, like last week with that sample app. That's not talking. I think there's a option in here. Talk. Let's go. Terrible. Also terrible.
So, did you like 2 coffees or 1 coffee and 1 upstairs?
That'll do. So we'll grab this sample. which is, imagine we rip this off of YouTube or something, and the first thing is it's really harsh and gross because it's not, hasn't been recorded in a really nice way. So the first thing I want to do is just get a little bell here and go over the spots and see which bits are like hurting my ears when I boost them. So like that bit was really harsh, so I'm just gonna sort of cut that out a bit. And I'll add another one of those, do the same thing. And that bit's a bit harsh as well, so I'll just dip that a bit. So that just helps to make it, sound a bit nicer. And I'm guessing that a lot of this high frequency we don't really need. So I'm going to keep playing it and just drag this in. And we can see like there, it's noticeably muffling it. So I'm going to go back. But at about this point, there's no difference as I go any higher. So I'm going to cut it off there. Like, as I said, if we want to cut out all the frequencies it doesn't need. So if we can pull the bottom up and pull the top down and not hear much of a difference, we want to do that. And even though we can't hear much of a difference on this sample, the repeated practice of doing this on every single sample at the end of the track will mean that everything's a lot cleaner because you don't have frequencies that don't need to be there. So that's just a bit of basic correction. Now, yo.
Just on frequencies.
Yeah.
How, is there a kind of basic rule for what frequencies do we need and what frequencies don't we need, and why and how?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And unfortunately, there's no blanket rule for that because it's more about you don't want it to have too much of a particular frequency or too little. And depending on the recording, that's going to determine how, this recording was a bit harsh at 1000 hertz. So I wanted to cut that away. But some recordings might not have enough at 1K, so you want to boost that a little bit. An image for that is frequency of vocals mixing. So you can look up something like this where it has a nice little description of sort of what these different frequencies are. So the 350 to 600 hertz, this is like the boxy region, so it can kind of sound a bit like boomy. But if you don't have enough of that, it's going to sound too hollow. So every frequency range, there'll be like a sound that if there's too much or too little. So before the mid-range bite, a busy area competes with guitar assist. That's not really giving us too much. But at 1 to 4K, if it's too much, it's going to be really harsh on the ears because that's where our ears are super sensitive to because of the voice, and our ears have been tuned to pick up human voice. But if there's not enough in 1 to 4K, you're not going to be able to understand what they're saying because that's also the frequencies that you're really trying to pick up on. So if you can't understand what they're saying, then maybe you want to boost that region. But if it sounds a bit too harsh, then you probably want to cut that region away a little bit. But if you search like vocal mixing cheat sheet or something like that, you see there's all sorts of ones. And I'm not going to spend too much time looking through them right now, but there are often ones where it actually says like too much will sound like this, not enough will sound like that. Unfortunately, with most other sounds, there's not as clear a cheat sheet for that, but vocals is one of those things that every engineer deals with. So there's some good things. So what I really like about vocals, and speech in particular, is that our human brain is so used to exactly what it should sound like. If you distort that at all, it becomes really trippy, because like you know exactly what it should sound like. So when it sounds different, you're like, oh, that's strange. So, you know, a typical, an easy thing to do would just be to pitch it. So I'm going to choose one of the warp settings that's not repitch, and maybe we could pitch it down a bit.
So you want 2 coffees or 1 coffee and 1 extra?
Or you could turn it up.
So you want 2 coffees or 1 coffee and 1 extra?
But it gets really fun.
You want 2 coffees?
Really fun where you kind of find some vowels.
So you want 2 coffees?
And I think this is coffee. So I'm going to zoom into this offy bit, add a warp marker there, add a warp marker here, and stretch it out. And then I want to put this on texture mode.
So you want 2 coffees or 1 coffee? So you want 2 coffees or 1?
Stretch out the 1.
So you want 2 coffees or 1 coffee and 1 extra?
And maybe we'll just stretch out that end bit a bit.
So you want 2 coffees or 1 coffee and 1 extra?
I think we need a little bit more space on there. And you see the looping here means that we're not actually seeing the whole sample because it's looping. So I'm just going to turn off that loop there, and then we can see the full sample.
So you want 2 coffees or 1 coffee and 1 extra? So you want 2 coffees or 1 coffee and 1 extra?
And just like we did before, we could go to envelopes, and maybe we'll add some transposition there. So you can do all sorts of really cool, trippy stuff with this. And, you know, we stretched out that bit as much as we could. But if we wanted to do more, we could do Control J to consolidate this. And then we can see it's all consolidated. And then I could grab this bit and stretch it again. As you can see, you can get all sorts of those sorts of really psychedelic sounds by stretching out vocals like so. So what sounded like a kind of, you know, bad sample, like you don't even, by the time you stretch it out, sometimes you can't even tell what they're actually saying. And it's just like the effect of having vocals in, like a voice in your track that can trigger that sort of ASMR effect where your ears sort of prick up and you're like, oh, there's just something about using, even if you don't want to have someone speaking or someone singing in your songs, just using the voice as the starting point to make a sound just creates these sounds that just really react with your brain because you associate it with someone's voice. Cool. Mm-hmm.
So I know when I first started, I got really scared of like EQing things, and sometimes it was easy just to go like cut off the lows, put like the low cut on there, roll off the highs a little bit, just with those like 3 knobs rather than having all the different points and stuff to choose from.
Totally. Let's have a look at that with some leads. That seems obnoxious enough. Ah. Cool. So you grab some sort of lead and you know that it's not sitting well in your track, but you might not feel confident enough to use an EQ8 to do super like precise EQing. In Ableton 12 you have this channel EQ. It's kind of similar to EQ3, but it is a lot smoother, as Chris mentioned. So we've got the channel EQ here, and we'll also put our default EQ8 that we made just before it. So this is just our safety EQ. But now if we want to just adjust the overall kind of balance of the sound, then we could just do something like this. And then you can see you can just like really smoothly take off the highs or mids. And another fantastic use for this channel EQ, and this can be super handy if you're writing on headphones, is that maybe you just want to put this on your master and just boost the bass a bit here. And then whenever you go to export your song, just remember to turn that off and export it. But then this way, whenever you're in your headphones, it's making it bassier for you on the master, so that then you're not boosting your kick and bass. So then when you're listening to it, it sounds like it's pumping, but then you just turn this off and then you export it, and actually the lows are at the right level. I've also noticed people sometimes produce like this, where they boost the lows and then they take the highs off. And this is the same idea, is that when you're using headphones or when you're producing for a really long time, the high frequencies get quite like tiring on your ears. So you might end up making the high frequencies lower in your song because you're like, they're tiring your ears. So again, you might want to just produce with the highs turned down a little bit and the lows turned up. And then you're making decisions based on that. And then when you export, you just turn that off, and then it all sort of flattens out a bit. And now just to kind of complete this sound to make it fit, I would probably go ahead and put a reverb on there. And maybe I'll put some echo on there too. On maybe 16ths. But what's happening now is we're creating long tails for this that are going to overlap with our kick. So what do we want to do with that? Well, we want to put a sidechain on there. So I'm going to just go back and grab my trusty sidechain that I had on my bass. Holding down Control, I can just drag that to copy it over onto this channel. And now we can see we have that breathing effect. It's still pretty hypey, but it definitely now it sits sort of nicer in the groove than the super raw sound that was there before. But the main takeaway from there is like to smooth it out and make it fit better. We put reverb and EQ on there, and then to make it sit around the kick, we put that sidechain on there so that it's bouncing off of the kick. So in this lesson, we've looked at samples and some music theory ideas on how we can pick samples that all fit together. We also looked at how to know what note the sample's actually playing, and we did that through using our EQ and seeing what frequencies are present. And like in this stab, we could do the same thing. We've got these clear spikes on D sharp, and we'd be able to say that sample's in D sharp. We looked at when you have to quantize a sample, that it's always good to flick through the different warp settings and see which one gives the sound that you're looking for, because every time you warp a sample, it will change its sound a bit. So you want to just find which one of these works for you. But typically they are named after what you should be warping. So beats for beats, tones for things that are tonal and stretched out. Texture is for atmospheres, or as we found with this Foley sample, texture is also really interesting when you stretch something out a lot, because that's what makes all of those interesting textural sounds. We looked at, pitching things up and down, but then if it's 1 or 2 semitones out, then we can very well just use this pitch here. But if we go more than, say, 3 up or 3 down, it's really going to start changing the actual texture of the sound as well. And we looked at using unconventional samples as extra layers in our track to give it some more interesting and unique sounds to it. Do people have questions about what we looked at, or just using samples in general, or things that you might find intimidating about downloading a sample and dropping it into your track?
Is there a way to, once you've warped it and done a lot of things and then consolidated it and then done other things, is there a way to go back and unconsolidate it and then go back and change the settings?
That's a good question.
Yeah,
no, there's not a way to go back other than Control Z. And but you can duplicate the track, or what you can do, I think duplicate's the best way. But once you do consolidate it and turn it into a new sample, it now will appear in this folder over here, where if you go to current project and samples, processed, and then everything you've consolidated ends up here. So after it's consolidated, if you lose it, you can find it in here. But no, you can't go back from a consolidation. Another place where you can find things is all of our recordings are in here. So if, for example, you record a bunch of stuff and then you delete it, that's always going to be in this recorded folder. And then, processed you have here. Now, the last thing to end on is right now, all of these samples that I've put into the project are not actually in the project. They exist somewhere else on my computer, and the project is just looking at where they are and putting it and then playing it into my track, which means that if I was to send Kieran this project right now, he would get the project and there'd be no samples in it, because the samples aren't actually in the project. They're just on my computer. So if you want to send your project to someone, you want to go File and then go Collect All and Save. And that actually now will import all of the samples into this project. So then you could just pass the project to someone and all of that will be there. And we can now see in our current project, there's an imported folder. And these are all the samples that I've imported in here. So as a general rule, if the safety of your project is what you prioritize, collect all and saving is really good, because it means all your samples will always be in that project. But as you might expect, that's going to make the project really big on your hard drive. And it also means that if you're always using the same samples, every single project that you have is going to have a copy of that sample, and that might be unnecessary in terms of like, you know, you don't want every project to be like 10 gigabytes. But if storage space is not an issue, then collect all and save is great, because it means that even if you lose your hard drive with all your samples on it, you can still open your project and listen to the song exactly how it's meant to be. Or if you cancel your Splice subscription and they take your samples and stuff, then they're still all in the project.
If you save it, not collect all and save, but you're opening it on your computer, it should just drop in like this.
Yes.
But it's just if you're sharing it with someone else, it won't drop in.
Yes. And sometimes if you open a project and they're not there for some reason, maybe you move the sample folder, then the bottom here will be orange and you can double click there, or alternatively you can right click on any sample and go manage sample files, and they'll all be here. And at the top here it'll be like locate files, and you can click that and then show Ableton where the samples are now, and then it will go, oh okay, that's where they all are, and then load it all in.
That's an automatic process. As long as you're following this kind of step, will it help localize where it's being moved to? Like if we've moved the sample?
If you move the sample, like if you move your sample folder, it won't know where it is until you click here and go locate samples. Yeah. But that, everyone will experience that at some point in their production life. Let's...
Yeah, that's what I'm
yeah, pretty much. And these days, like... Yeah, and these days...
You just move the folder one day and you forget you actually did it, and then you can't even access the project.
That's what I mean, like when you do that process, Gabe, you
Yeah.
have to still manually tell it where you moved it to, right? It's not
Yes.
gonna find it.
No, it's not going to find it.
And then what if you don't know where to move it? It's not getting moved to.
Yeah. And I feel like these days, since you can buy a terabyte for like $100, like a terabyte, that's going to be like 100 projects at least, if not like 200 projects. So you may as well spend $100, and then, you know, once you finish with a project, just move it on, like collect all and save, move it onto the hard drive. And then at least all your projects, even in 10 years, when you have a new computer, a new hard drive, whatever, you can just open up that project and it will work, and you won't be looking for samples.
When you consolidate the sample,
Mm-hmm.
save it, we can, like on another project, can you use that same sample?
Yes. Anything that's been recorded or consolidated is now in the project.
Any project, as long as it's on your Ableton.
Yeah. Yeah, and you could even, for example, while we're talking about the browser here, say I'm like, oh, I used a really cool snare in that song. Maybe I just want that snare. I don't actually have to open up that project and look for it. I can just go to my project. So I've just added my Ableton folder here. Wherever you save your projects, you can add it as a folder in here. Maybe it's at the top. What? Usually says add folder at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I don't know what's going on, but usually down here it says add folder. Maybe it's different in Ableton 12. It does? Yeah, okay. And then you just tell it where your projects are. I've got mine just here. And I can open up just any project. And then here you can see all the different saves, because I like to, at the beginning of every session, go save as, and then add like a 002 or 003 or whatever. And I like doing that for a couple reasons. One, if it gets corrupted or if you lose the project or something, you only have to go back one session. And two, it gives me a lot more confidence consolidating, flattening, committing things to audio, because I know that, well, at the very least, I can just go back to the previous version. So if you had a bunch of samples and you're just about to consolidate them all, that might be a good time to just go make a new version, like save as 002. And then you can do what I'm doing here, where you can actually open up that project. It shows you all of the channels here. And then when I open up this group, I could drag in just that channel. Give it a bit of time to think. And here we can see the entire snaps channel of that track. So yeah, you never have to like close the project and open up another project and then grab the sound. You just find the project in your browser and then open the, drop down the project, find the version, drop down the version, find the track, and then just drag that track in.
So in the previous version, for
Mm-hmm.
example, like 17,
Yep.
will that also have this snaps that you've done previously?
Yep.
Yeah, okay.
It'll have every channel that existed at that version. But most likely, this version will have a bunch of channels that were in MIDI, and then I've turned them into audio, and so I've made a new version because we'll look at this more when we're looking at MIDI. But a way of consolidating the entire track, for example, this one where we had this echo automation. If I right click here and go freeze and flatten, now that has been turned into audio. But just like consolidating, there's no way to go back from that. I can go Control Z, but once I move on from there, I can't go back. So usually what I'll do is I'll have a bunch of stuff, none of it flattened. And then I'll be like, okay, today I'm going to flatten a bunch of stuff because my CPU's in overdrive. I'll make new version, maybe have like 003 in brackets freeze, and then I'll freeze and flatten everything and I'll move on. But if at any point I go, oh, I wish I had that channel back, I could just go to a previous version and drag it in. And yeah, this has saved me on so many accounts for so many different reasons. Like one, corruption or channels, or like, you know, especially if you're using cracked plugins, sometimes that plugin will just decide to not work anymore or whatever. Then you could go to a previous version and bring it in as well. And it also just gives me that confidence that I can always just like flatten and consolidate stuff, and I don't have to be like, oh, but what if I want to change it later? Because I could always just go back to a previous version and grab it.
Do you find the corruption only generally happens when you have or you are using those cracked plugins? Or
Yeah. Oh, I don't think I've ever had an issue with something I've purchased. Not that I've ever cracked software, but but like usually sometimes it'll just stuff up one channel if you were to crack software, or it might actually corrupt, like it could cause an issue with the entire project and you might not be able to open it. Thankfully, Ableton support, if you own Ableton, the support's incredible, and you can usually just send them the project and then they can send it back and it's working. But yeah, it still can happen. And sometimes you can have issues with the project, even if you're using all legitimate stuff. Maybe it might be a bit more common on Windows than Mac. I hear Mac is more stable, but it's still probably only happened like 2 in 100 projects or something like that. So it's one of those, like once a year I might have a problem like that, and usually it's a pretty easy fix. I think I've only ever lost one project ever from something, like not able to keep working on it. So not too bad.
I feel like it's a really good segue just into asking how you organise all your projects and sessions on your computer and how you back them up.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that is a good question. So for organization, you can see here, I have, and some of my projects are on my other computer, but I have like my master folder. For me, it's just labeled the day that I installed Ableton. And then I've got these projects outside of the project backups folder. And then anything I'm working on, I'll put in the project backups folder. And then I use Google Drive. I pay something like $100 a year for like 2 terabytes of storage. and I have all my projects and all my samples backed up on Google Drive. And on Google Drive, you can like select this folder to back up, or you can just manually back them up by dragging the projects onto Google Drive. I think I'm about to redo it and not have a separate folder for project backups and just have it all in one folder, and then just have Google Drive sync my full projects folder. But that's just going to mean like 24 hours without touching my computer because it's going to have to upload them all. So I've been just putting that off a little bit. But yeah, Google Drive or Dropbox, like at least within the last couple of years, online cloud storage has just gotten so cheap that I'm actually just prioritizing that over putting it on hard drives. I also have all my projects backed up on multiple hard drives that are like, kind of like, you know, one of them's like hidden and one of them's on my desk, and like, you know, just in case my room gets stolen, like raided or something like that, like, you know, if people were to come in and steal all my shit, then there's still like a hard drive hidden away with my projects. But yeah, I reckon cloud storage is like the way to go these days, probably, as long as Google doesn't go bankrupt, which I don't think's happening anytime soon. Any other questions? Not Xenon. Oh, so we're doing 2 versions, but my version is coming out on Subspecies 4 in like a couple weeks. And then, yeah, his version's coming out on his Xenon album.
And for hard drive versus SSD for storing projects and samples.
Yeah. So if if you have samples, SSD is a lot better because, as we saw, like it's actively grabbing the samples as it's playing them. So we want that to be quick. But if you're actually launching a project off of the hard drive, SSD. But if it's just for backup, HDD. Although saying that, SSD also has a longer life, so maybe SSD would be safer as well. But it is like more expensive, so. But yeah, anything like if you don't have much space on your computer and you're going to store all your samples on a external hard drive, or SSD is the way to go for that because it's quicker. Any other questions?
I have a question. If I have, let's say, similar project and my friends give me also another project and I want to drag and drop some channels from one to another,
Mm-hmm.
does it possible?
Yep, it's done the same way.
Drag and drop.
Yeah, so you would, wherever that folder is located on your computer, you'd add that as a location in here. Which, as I said, like...
I can see it here in places. It's got it add folder. Yeah.
Have you added too many tags?
That's what I'm thinking.
Usually it's just down the bottom.
Yeah, I swear it's not somewhere else. No. That is so weird. I've never not seen that there. Maybe if I close this. That's embarrassing. But yeah, I swear, generally there's an add folder button there and you can add it. Don't exactly know what's going on with Ableton right now. Maybe if I save. Or you can do what I've done is just like have desktop there or something, and then you'll be able to see whatever's on your desktop. But yeah, I've got some projects here, and you know, this is a completely different project, but the same can be done. Finding the project file, clicking that little down arrow, and then it will open every single track, and you can just drag it across. If the track is in a different BPM, then obviously you might have to warp it to fit the BPM of your track. But yeah, it's all super compatible. Like we could just, even if I wanted to, oh, that's going to take way too long. But even if I want to drop in like a whole group, I can do that as well. So like this is the entire Atmos group, and it will take a while to load because it's loading them all.
The add folder button isn't there because you've got 2 instances of Live open.
Huh.
Or if you
Hey, there it is. I don't know why I had 2 instances of Live open, but yeah, correct.
So you open in one instance one project, and second instance second project. And
Yeah.
then drag and drop.
Oh, you don't have to because of this way of searching for projects just within the browser here, then you actually don't have to drag them across. You can just drag them straight in. It's just taking a minute because it's loading all those Atmos. Yeah, so yeah, you just find the project folder, find the project file, and then you can expand it. And all of these are not actually files, these are the channels from the track. And then I can drag any of those channels into the project.
But you do it often when you write music.
Pardon?
You do it when you write the music.
Yeah, a lot, because often, I'll be working on a song and I'll be like, oh, I had really good shakers in the last song. I'm just going to go and find that and then drag those shakers in instead of looking for the sample again or something like that. Or a synthesizer that I liked, I can just drag it in. Which is great because before this feature was implemented, you would have to actually close the project, go over to the other project, drag it across, and by the time that's over, you've like lost your flow and you're like, doesn't matter, I'm gonna go watch TV now anyway, or whatever. So,
Using that like method of taking, whatever it is, some kind of channel from a past track
yep.
to a new track is also a way of creating like a continuity of your own style or your own sound.
Yeah, for sure. And also saving presets is a really good way of doing that too. I can't really vouch for that because I haven't really done it very much, but yeah, if you ever find a preset of a synth that you really like, then you can save that as a preset as well. So I know we're going a bit over, so I'll just might make this the last thing. So I'm going to just drag in a VST, and I want to be able to play the notes, so I select this little keyboard up here and then arm the track, solo it, and say I'm looking for some cool I'm looking through my presets and I go, oh, that's a really cool sound, I want to use that again. I could save that as a preset within the VST, but I can also, just like I did before with the EQ, click this little floppy disk here, and then I can save that as a preset in my user library. And then you could just name it something that's useful, and then you can build up a bunch of your presets there and just drag them in as well. And that's a good way to keep consistency. It's also just a good way to keep workflow. Like, it's the reason I use Splice is not necessarily because you can't get great samples of a sample pack, but we really want to keep in the creative flow as much as possible and the IT side as least as possible. And looking for a sample for 5 minutes is a good way to just ruin your creative flow, because you're like, I want a snare. Searching for a snare for 5 minutes. Okay, there it is. And then you've kind of lost your idea. Whereas if you've got your samples really well organized, boring and hard, or if you use Splice and you can find a sample really quickly, it just means that you can continue on with your creative flow as quick as possible. And that's the same idea as keeping synths presets and stuff like that. It's like you could make it from scratch every time, but if you think that's going to slow you down or ruin your flow, it's going to be quicker to like drag in one you've already used and change it a little bit rather than starting from scratch every time. Because ultimately, like, the most important thing is that you stay inspired and stay engaged in the project. So anything that can keep that moving quicker is going to help your song overall. Cool. So we'll wrap up the workshop on samples here today. I hope you see that there's all sorts of cool and creative and unique things that you can do with samples. In no way is it just drag and drop and, you know, just use a sample for what it is. There's all sorts of different effects you can do, and stretching and warping and changing the pitch and changing the position of the notes and stuff, so you can really make it work for your track and manipulate it into however you want. Yep.
Another question about, let's say I record some piano. Do you know how to reverse the sample?
Yep. So for example, when you record the piano, the only difference is that when we did this and we chose one of the channels within our project, you would go to external in, and then you could go in here, and then you could record. Oh, you got to arm it. Hello. Ooh. Ooh. Oh. Hello. Ooh. Ee. So you'd record it in like that. You can just turn that off there. Put this back to no input. Hello. Ooh. Ee. And then if you wanted to reverse that, you could either press the R key, but you can see R does nothing right now. And that's because I have this keyboard engaged. So I'll turn that off. Press R, that's going to reverse it. Or you can press the reverse button here as well. And then you can, stretch it out. Texture mode. Get all sorts of cool textures. Sweet.